Under the cold glare of fluorescent lights, a man in a weathered uniform sits motionless, his hand locked around the tether to his unshakable companion. Then, a low, guttural growl rips through the silence, a warning of something sinister slinking nearer. What's about to unfold as those eyes fix on the void ahead? Before continuing the story, tell me which city you're watching from. I want to know how far this video has come. Don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel so I can send you exciting stories like this every day. Thank you. Let's get into it. His fingers clench the leash of the canine beside him, a German shepherd with a steady yet vigilant presence. To onlookers, Zeus appeared as just another military service dog, but to John, he was far beyond that. He was kin. John's jaw stiffened as the judge spoke to him, pointing out that this could be his last opportunity to plead his case. The military had ruled that Zeus would be redeployed, deemed government equipment essential for a new assignment. After years of facing peril side by side, the idea of losing Zeus now struck John like a bitter stab of disloyalty. His hands shook as he shifted his hold on the leash, his voice quivering but resolute as he spoke. "Your Honor," he started, his words laced with unfiltered feeling. "Zeus isn't merely a tool of war. He preserved my life in ways no one here could fathom. Out there, he dragged me from harm, guarded me against bullets, and signaled hidden dangers before I could spot them. When I returned, when I couldn't bear my own reflection, Zeus stayed by me. He gave me a purpose to press on. Please don't rip him away." The chamber held its breath, the atmosphere dense with silent compassion. Some in the audience wiped tears from their cheeks, while others traded looks, their faces blending sorrow and anger. The judge's expression stayed impassive, his gaze lingering on John for a drawn-out pause before he leaned in, ready to issue his verdict. But before he could utter a syllable, something startling occurred. Zeus jolted upright, wrenching the leash from John's unsteady grasp. The dog advanced toward the judge, baying loudly, his cries resounding across the courtroom. The onlookers inhaled sharply, and the bailiff moved forward on reflex, though Zeus displayed no hostility. His barks were urgent, intentional, as if conveying a pressing message. "Zeus!" John shouted, his voice fracturing with alarm. Yet in his gut, he understood. He'd witnessed this pattern too often in combat. Zeus wasn't merely barking, he was sounding an alarm. The courtroom's whispers swelled. "What's up with that dog?" someone murmured from the rear. John's chest constricted as he rolled himself closer, his voice faltering. "He's not just making noise. He only acts like this when trouble's near. He's signaling a warning." The judge went rigid, his gavel idle in his palm, his eyes fixed on Zeus. Silence reclaimed the room, pierced only by the dog's barks, pulsing like a lifeline. Whatever Zeus detected, it wasn't solely about John. The dog grasped something beyond everyone else's perception, and for the first time that day, John sensed a spark of possibility. This wasn't just a farewell. Something greater was brewing, and Zeus was resolute in forcing them all to recognize it. The stillness was broken only by Zeus's ceaseless barking. Each piercing yelp reverberated through the expansive courtroom, ricocheting off the shadowed wooden panels and slicing through the strain like a razor. Zeus stood poised, muscles taut, ears flattened, and gaze riveted on the judge's platform. John's hands clamped harder on his wheelchair's armrests as he observed the dog. This wasn't aimless noise. Zeus's posture told a story no one could mistake. He had detected something. John's heart pounded, a rush of adrenaline reminding him of moments on the battlefield. But this wasn't war. This was supposed to be a courtroom, a place of order. "Zeus, heel!" John called, his voice firm but trembling. Zeus briefly glanced back at him, his gaze sharp, as if to reassure his handler that he was in control. Then, without hesitation, Zeus returned his focus, pacing in short, deliberate steps in front of the judge's bench. His barks shifted to deep, guttural growls that sent a shiver through the room. The audience began murmuring nervously, the earlier sympathy for John now morphing into palpable unease. "Mr. Carter," the judge said, his tone laced with irritation, "control your dog or I will have to—" "Your Honor," John interrupted, his voice louder, steadier, though his chest tightened with fear. Zeus isn't misbehaving. He's trained to detect threats, bombs, explosives, danger. He wouldn't act like this unless he felt something was wrong. The room fell silent again as John's words settled in. His explanation shifted the atmosphere, replacing skepticism with a creeping sense of dread. Before anyone could respond, Zeus suddenly stopped barking. The abrupt silence was jarring, almost deafening. Zeus's body went completely rigid as his head snapped toward the far end of the courtroom. His ears perked sharply, and a low, menacing growl rumbled from his chest. The shift was so sudden, so intense that even the judge froze. All eyes turned toward the heavy wooden doors leading into the courtroom. A collective unease settled over the room, and the murmurs turned to panicked whispers. John's breathing quickened as he followed Zeus's line of sight. His pulse thundered in his ears. He had seen this exact behavior before on the battlefield, moments before Zeus uncovered a buried explosive or signaled an enemy ambush. Whatever Zeus sensed now wasn't good. "Zeus?" John whispered, his voice breaking with tension. "What is it?" But Zeus didn't move. His entire body remained locked in place, his growl growing deeper, vibrating through the air like a warning. Whatever danger he had detected, it was no longer just a threat to John. It was something that could put everyone in that room at risk. The low growl from Zeus reverberated through the courtroom like distant thunder, freezing everyone in place. All eyes were fixed on the dog, his body tense, his gaze locked on the heavy wooden doors at the far end of the room. Even the judge, who moments ago had been prepared to reprimand John, now seemed unnerved. His gavel remained forgotten in his hand as he exchanged uneasy glances with the bailiffs. The air felt electric, thick with a tension that no one could explain. John's breath came faster, his hands gripping the armrests of his wheelchair as if bracing himself for a blast. He had seen this before too many times to count. On the battlefield, Zeus's instincts had been the difference between life and death. His warning had always meant one thing. Danger was close, very close. "Stay calm," John murmured to himself, but the words felt hollow, even to him. The bailiffs, unsure of how to proceed, hesitated by the judge's bench. One of them, a man with a broad frame and a wary expression, finally stepped forward, his hand resting on the weapon at his hip. "It's just a dog, right?" he muttered, though his voice betrayed his own unease, probably reacting to the noise or the crowd. But even as he spoke, his steps were cautious, his movements deliberate. John shook his head, his voice rising just enough to cut through the murmurs of the crowd. "No, Zeus doesn't react to noise or people like this. He's trained to sense danger, things we can't see. Trust me, if he's growling like that, there's a reason." His words hung in the air, and for a moment no one moved. The judge, visibly unsettled, finally nodded at the bailiffs, motioning for them to investigate the door. Zeus's growl grew louder as the bailiffs approached the door. The larger man reached out hesitantly, his hand gripping the metal handle. For a moment, the room seemed to hold its breath. John's heart pounded as he watched, every muscle in his body coiled with anticipation. Zeus's body remained rigid, his growls turning into a series of sharp, clipped barks as the handle began to turn. The door creaked open, revealing the dark hallway beyond. At first it seemed empty, but Zeus's barking only intensified, his eyes fixed on something unseen. The larger bailiff took a step into the hallway, his hand still on his weapon. He glanced back at the courtroom, his face pale, and then turned forward again. A second later, his voice broke the silence. "There's something here." John's pulse quickened as he leaned forward in his chair, his chest tight with dread. Whatever something the bailiff had seen, it was enough to make Zeus's instincts flare to life. And John knew better than anyone, Zeus was never wrong. The air in the courtroom seemed to grow heavier, as if the tension itself was pulling the oxygen from the room. Zeus's barking echoed sharply, each sound reverberating off the wooden walls. His body remained locked in a stance of pure alertness, muscles taut, head low, and his gaze fixed like a laser on the dark hallway beyond the open door. The larger bailiff, now visibly uneasy, took another hesitant step forward, his boots clicking softly against the tiled floor. His hand hovered near his weapon, his body stiff with caution, as though expecting something to lunge out of the shadows. "What's going on out there?" the judge demanded, his voice cracking slightly despite his attempt to maintain authority. He gripped the gavel tightly, his knuckles pale as his eyes darted nervously between the doorway and Zeus. The dog's growls deepened, a low, menacing rumble that vibrated through the courtroom and sent shivers down the spines of everyone present. The larger bailiff glanced back toward the room, his face pale and tight with uncertainty. "I don't see anything," he said hesitantly, his words measured, but something doesn't feel right. His gaze shifted back to the hallway, his brow furrowed as if trying to shake off his own doubts. "It's quiet, too quiet." His voice was barely above a whisper, but it carried through the silent room like a gunshot. John leaned forward in his wheelchair, his stomach twisting into knots. He had heard those words before, "too quiet," countless times on the battlefield, and they had always preceded disaster. His voice rose, cutting through the rising murmurs of the crowd. "Zeus doesn't react to nothing. If he's acting like this, there's a reason. We need to evacuate the room now." His command rang with urgency, but the spectators froze, paralyzed by fear and confusion. The smaller bailiff stepped forward, drawing a flashlight from his belt and aiming the beam into the hallway. The bright light cut through the shadows, illuminating the length of the polished floor. "There's nothing," he muttered, his tone uneasy. "It's just an empty hallway." But even as he spoke, his hand trembled slightly, betraying his calm facade. Zeus, however, was far from calm. The dog's growling only grew louder, his barking more frantic as his body strained forward, almost yanking the leash from John's grip. Suddenly, a sharp metallic clang echoed down the hallway, the sound unmistakable and jarring in the suffocating silence. The smaller bailiff flinched, his flashlight beam shaking as he instinctively stepped back. Zeus lunged toward the sound, barking ferociously, his claws scraping against the floor as he strained against his leash. Gasps erupted from the courtroom and panic began to ripple through the crowd. The larger bailiff instinctively drew his weapon, his voice tight with alarm. What the hell was that? John's heart pounded in his chest as he raised his voice above the chaos. "Get Zeus back!" he yelled, his voice trembling with a mix of fear and certainty. He's never wrong. Something's coming. But before anyone could respond, the metallic clang echoed again, louder this time, as if whatever had caused it was now much closer. The air felt thick, charged with an invisible energy that sent a wave of dread through the room. Whatever Zeus had sensed, it was no longer a question of if, it was now a question of when. The metallic clang echoed again, sharper, closer, like an alarm ringing in the depths of the hallway. Tension in the courtroom snapped tighter, the weight of the unknown pressing down on everyone present. Zeus barked ferociously, his body straining against the leash, as though his sheer will could push through the doorway and confront whatever was out there. John gripped the leash tightly, his knuckles white, his pulse racing in his ears. He could feel it now too. Something was wrong. Something was coming. The larger bailiff stepped fully into the hallway, his gun drawn and his eyes scanning the dimly lit corridor. His partner followed cautiously, flashlight trembling slightly in his hand. The beam cut through the darkness, but the hallway appeared empty, silent, and still. Yet Zeus's barking didn't waver, his growls growing deeper, more insistent. John's instincts screamed at him to act, to shout for an evacuation, but he could already see the fear paralyzing the room. No one was moving. "Do you see anything?" the judge called out, his voice cracking as he leaned forward in his seat. The gavel trembled slightly in his hand and his usual air of authority was replaced with an unmistakable edge of fear. The larger bailiff glanced over his shoulder, his face pale and glistening with sweat. "Nothing yet," he said, his voice low but tight, as if he were afraid that speaking too loudly would provoke whatever might be lurking. "But it doesn't feel right." He took another step forward, the weight of his boots echoing down the hall. The spectators in the courtroom whispered nervously, some clutching their belongings, others inching toward the exits. The uneasy energy in the room was spreading like wildfire. John wheeled himself forward slightly, his eyes locked on Zeus, who had gone silent again. The dog's ears were rigid, his body motionless, his eyes still fixed on the open doorway. "Zeus is locked onto something," John said, his voice trembling. "I don't know what it is, but it's there." And then just as the bailiff reached the halfway point in the hallway, a shadow moved. It was brief, barely perceptible, but it was enough to make the smaller bailiff stumble backward, his flashlight beam jerking wildly. "There!" he shouted, his voice filled with panic. The larger bailiff froze, his gun snapping up, aimed at the darkness. Zeus erupted into barking again, lunging so hard against his leash that John's grip nearly gave out. "Back up!" John shouted, his voice echoing in the courtroom. "Get out of there!" The judge slammed his gavel, trying to regain order, but the sound was swallowed by the growing chaos. People were rising from their seats, murmurs turning to shouts as the panic spread. And then from the darkness of the hallway came another sound, a heavy, deliberate footstep. It wasn't hurried, it wasn't rushed, it was calm, and it was getting closer. Zeus's barking turned into a snarl, his teeth bared as his body pushed forward with unrelenting force. John felt his chest tighten as dread flooded his body. Whatever was in that hallway wasn't in a hurry, it wasn't hiding, it was coming straight for them, and it wanted to be seen. The heavy footstep echoed louder than the courtroom could bear, cutting through the growing chaos like a blade. Zeus's snarls filled the air, his body pulling against the leash with such force that John had to anchor himself in his wheelchair to keep from being yanked forward. The tension was suffocating now, every pair of eyes locked on the dark hallway, the source of the sound that no one wanted to face. "Everyone stay calm," the judge shouted, slamming his gavel again, but the command fell on deaf ears. People were rising from their seats, clutching their bags, their hands, anything they could find, as if holding on to something would save them from the unknown threat. The larger bailiff stood frozen in the hallway, his gun raised and aimed into the darkness. His partner remained behind him, the flashlight beam darting nervously across the walls, catching every shadow but revealing nothing concrete. John's voice broke through the mounting noise. "Get out of there!" he shouted, his tone sharp and urgent. "Whatever it is, it's not safe." His words cut like a knife, but the larger bailiff didn't move. Instead, he squinted into the dim corridor, his jaw tight, and then the shadow moved again. This time it was unmistakable, slow, deliberate, purposeful. The smaller bailiff gasped audibly, his flashlight shaking in his trembling hand. "There's someone there," he stammered, his voice barely above a whisper. The light caught something for a fraction of a second, a silhouette tall and looming. It disappeared almost as quickly as it had appeared, retreating back into the darkness. But it was enough to send a wave of fear rippling through the room. The larger bailiff tightened his grip on his weapon, his voice steady but low. "Show yourself," he barked, his tone commanding. "Step out where I can see you." But the only response was silence, thick, oppressive silence that seemed to stretch for an eternity. Zeus's barking reached a fever pitch, his teeth bared as his body coiled like a spring, ready to lunge, and then it happened. A figure stepped into the light, slowly, calmly, almost unnervingly so. It was a man, his face obscured by a hood, his hands tucked into the pockets of a heavy coat. His movements were deliberate, his posture oddly relaxed despite the chaos he'd caused. He stopped just at the edge of the flashlight's beam, his head tilted slightly, as if amused by the scene in front of him. Zeus's growling turned feral, his claws scraping the floor as John strained to hold him back. "Who are you?" the larger bailiff demanded, his gun locked on the figure. The man didn't answer. Instead, he took another slow step forward, the faintest hint of a smirk visible beneath the shadow of his hood. John's breath caught in his chest as an overwhelming sense of dread washed over him. Something about the man felt wrong, not just threatening, but deeply, fundamentally wrong. The man raised his hands slowly, the motion causing both bailiffs to tense and grip their weapons tighter. "Relax," the man said, his voice low, calm, and chillingly confident. "I'm not here to hurt anyone," but the way he spoke, the way his words lingered in the air, only made the room feel colder. John knew immediately this man was lying, and Zeus knew it too. The room fell into a stunned silence as the man stood at the edge of the hallway, his figure partially illuminated by the unsteady beam of the flashlight. Zeus's growls were now constant, low, and guttural, vibrating through the tense courtroom. The bailiffs held their weapons firm, their hands trembling despite their years of training. John's heart hammered in his chest as he stared at the stranger. The man's posture was too calm, too deliberate, as if he thrived on the unease he was creating. "Step forward, slowly," the larger bailiff ordered, his voice tight with authority, though a hint of fear seeped into his tone. The man tilted his head slightly, his face still obscured by the hood, and then took one step closer, his boots clicking softly against the tiled floor. He moved with an unsettling confidence, each movement slow and calculated, as though he were savoring every second of the attention now fixated on him. Zeus barked furiously, lunging forward against his leash, his claws scraping the floor. John struggled to hold him back, his palms slick with sweat as his grip tightened. "Zeus knows," John muttered under his breath, his voice trembling. "He can sense it. He knows something's not right." His words weren't loud enough to reach the crowd, but the judge glanced at him briefly, his expression a mixture of fear and confusion. The smaller bailiff stepped forward, flashlight in one hand and his other hovering near his holster. "Sir," he said, his voice cracking slightly, "identify yourself." Now, the man finally lifted his head, his face partially visible beneath the shadow of his hood. His eyes were sharp, cold, and piercing, holding an intensity that sent a chill down John's spine. "I'm not here to hurt anyone," the man repeated, his voice calm yet unnervingly hollow. He reached into his pocket slowly, causing both bailiffs to stiffen and raise their weapons further. Gasps rippled through the courtroom, and someone in the back whispered, "He's got something." The room felt ready to erupt, the tension of fragile thread that could snap at any moment. John's instincts screamed at him to act, but he was frozen, gripping Zeus's leash as if it were the only thing anchoring him to the moment. The stranger's hand emerged from his pocket, holding something small and metallic. The bailiff shouted in unison, "Drop it!" The man froze, his lips curling into a faint smirk. "Relax," he said smoothly, holding the object up. It glinted in the dim light, revealing itself to be a simple key, but John's unease only deepened. There was no relief in the air, no sense of safety. Zeus's barking didn't falter, his focus locked on the man as if the key was nothing but a distraction. John's grip on the leash tightened as he whispered to himself, "It's not what it looks like. He's hiding something. He has to be." The man's smile widened as if he could hear John's thoughts, and the dread in the room became suffocating. The room felt like it was on the verge of imploding. All eyes were locked on the man holding the key, his smirk a sharp contrast to the panic spreading through the courtroom. Zeus's barking was relentless, his growls deep and guttural, as if trying to sound an alarm no one could ignore. John's hands trembled as he tightened his grip on the leash, his chest heaving with the weight of his instincts screaming louder than the chaos around him. Something wasn't right. This man wasn't just a threat. He was the tip of something much larger, much darker. "Drop the key and back away." The larger bailiff barked again, his weapon still trained on the man. The smaller bailiff edged closer, flashlight steady, but his face pale with unease. The man, seemingly unfazed by the guns pointed at him, tilted his head slightly, his gaze flickering toward Zeus. "That dog," he said, his voice low and almost conversational. "He's special, isn't he? Always knows things before they happen. That's what makes him so valuable." His tone was calm, but the weight of his words sent a ripple of dread through the room. John's stomach dropped. How did this man know about Zeus, about his abilities, his instincts? The hair on the back of John's neck stood on end as he forced himself to speak. "How do you know that?" he demanded, his voice sharp and shaking in equal measure. Zeus barked even louder, lunging forward against the leash as if trying to protect John from something only he could see. The man's smirk grew, his eyes glinting with something sinister. The stranger slowly raised the key, his movements deliberate, almost taunting. "You'll find out soon enough," he said, his voice chilling in its certainty. And then with a sharp metallic click, he turned the key in his hand. The sound was subtle, but its effect was immediate. Zeus erupted into a frenzy, barking louder than ever. And before anyone could react, the lights in the courtroom flickered violently. A moment of pure darkness swept through the room, and in the black void, John could hear gasps, shouts, and the scrape of chairs as people scrambled in fear. When the lights flickered back on, the stranger was no longer alone. Behind him, emerging from the hallway like shadows come to life, were two more figures. Their faces were obscured, but their movements were deliberate, their presence radiating menace. Both were holding weapons, sharp metallic shapes that caught the light just enough to make their purpose clear. John's heart raced as he looked at Zeus, who was now growling so ferociously it sounded almost primal. Whatever was happening, it was no longer just about a man with a key. This was something much, much bigger, and it had just begun. The courtroom descended into pure chaos. Spectators pushed toward the exits, voices rising in confusion and fear, while chairs scraped loudly against the floor. The two figures behind the stranger moved further into the room, their presence alone enough to send a ripple of dread through everyone. Zeus barked incessantly, his body low, every muscle in him ready to spring forward. John's grip on the leash tightened as adrenaline surged through him. He knew without a shadow of a doubt that the stranger wasn't bluffing. Zeus was the reason they were here. "Everyone stay calm," the judge yelled, slamming his gavel again, though his voice was drowned out by the panic swelling in the room. The larger bailiff stepped forward, holding his ground, his flashlight now focused on the stranger. "Stay where you are," he commanded, but the stranger didn't stop. Instead, he took another slow step forward, his movements deliberate, his expression eerily calm. The figures behind him mirrored his pace, adding to the suffocating tension. The stranger finally spoke, his voice smooth and measured, cutting through the noise. "No one needs to get hurt. All I want is the dog." His words were calm, but the undertone of authority in his voice sent chills down John's spine. Zeus growled low, his sharp gaze locked on the stranger, unrelenting in his stance. John's heart pounded in his chest. "You're not taking him," he said, his voice strong but edged with emotion. He wheeled himself slightly closer to Zeus, keeping his hand firm on the leash. "He's not just a dog. He's my partner, my family. I don't care who you are or what you think you're entitled to. You're not taking him." His words hung in the air, and for a moment the entire room seemed to hold its breath. The stranger's smirk faded, his eyes narrowing as he studied John. "You're making this more complicated than it needs to be," he said coolly. His gaze shifted back to Zeus, the faintest hint of frustration flashing across his face. "He's special, you know that. But keeping him will only make things harder for you." John's jaw tightened, his grip firm on Zeus's leash. "Zeus stays with me," he said firmly, his voice unwavering. Around him, the murmurs of the crowd swelled again, some voices calling for calm while others whispered in fear about what was going to happen next. The tension in the room felt unbearable, every moment stretching into an eternity. Zeus barked sharply again, snapping the room back to the present. His attention on the intruder was unyielding, as if he fully grasped what hung in the balance. John's chest constricted as he edged forward in his wheelchair, prepared to go to any lengths to shield the one companion who had never failed him. Regardless of the stranger's motives, John was resolute on one truth. Zeus was staying, and this confrontation was nowhere near its end. The courtroom brimmed with strain, every soul inside locked in a quiet turmoil as the stranger stood rigid, his gaze fixed on Zeus. The dog's deep growls rolled like far-off storm clouds, his frame taut and poised to protect. John, clutching the leash with both fists, stared straight at the intruder, his own resolve mirroring the steadfast devotion of the canine by his side. The pair of figures behind the stranger stayed motionless, their shadowy presence hovering yet holding back. It was a deadlock, one that felt like it dragged on forever. The judge, cutting through the oppressive quiet, coughed lightly and spoke with as much command as he could summon. "You've interrupted a legal proceeding. This stops here. Bailiffs, remove these men." His tone wavered faintly, but it was enough to spark the tension anew. The bailiffs, steadying themselves, advanced warily. Zeus unleashed another piercing bark, teeth glinting as his eyes tracked every twitch from the intruders. The stranger lifted a hand slowly, gesturing for his associates to halt. His demeanor softened, not into fury, but something akin to acceptance. "This isn't finished," he said evenly, his words heavy with a foreboding edge. "You think it's only about the dog, but it's far greater than that. You'll understand soon enough." He stepped back, a smirk creeping onto his face, devoid of any warmth, just a chilling, measured assurance. "I'll leave for now, but he's ours, John, and we'll return." John's chest squeezed tighter, his hold on Zeus's leash unrelenting. "He belongs to me alone," he declared, his voice firm and unwavering, "and whatever you're chasing, you'll have to get past us both." His statement landed like a hammer blow, and for the first time, the stranger hesitated, his eyes narrowing as if sizing John up once more. Then, without another sound, he pivoted, signaling his companions to trail him. The room's pressure didn't lift until they vanished through the same entrance they'd come from. The hush that followed was overwhelming. Onlookers gradually settled back into their chairs, murmurs weaving through the crowd as they grappled with the scene they'd witnessed. The judge let out a long breath, placing his gavel down with a quivering hand. "Court's adjourned," he muttered, his voice nearly lost amid the soft buzz. Yet John stayed put, his stare still glued to the doorway. Zeus finally eased down, his growl subsiding, though his senses remained sharp. John reached out, his fingers lightly grazing the dog's fur. "You did great, pal," he murmured, his tone thick with appreciation and weariness. As the courtroom steadily cleared, John lingered, his mind spinning. He had no clue who that man was or what they sought from Zeus, but one fact stood firm. This was far from over. For the moment, though, as Zeus pressed against his leg, John allowed himself the fleeting calm of this pause. Whatever lay ahead, they'd tackle it as a team. As the courtroom doors swing shut and the echo of those heavy footsteps fades into silence, we're left with a whirlwind of emotions too powerful to put into words. From the heart-pounding tension as the loyal dog sensed danger, to the electrifying standoff with that mysterious stranger, this story isn't just a battle for an unbreakable bond between man and beast. It's a testament to how loyalty and courage can shine through even the darkest moments. Watching that weathered veteran hold tight to the leash, his unwavering gaze locked with his steadfast companion, you can't help but feel a surge of warmth and pride, a connection that defies every threat, every shadow lurking in the wings. But the question lingers, has the danger truly vanished? Or is this just the opening act of something even more gripping? The truth, it seems, is still out there, waiting for us to uncover. If stories like this, packed with raw emotion and jaw-dropping twists, keep you on the edge of your seat, then hit that subscribe button on our YouTube channel. Every week we bring you fresh journeys, unsolved mysteries, and moments that'll tug at your heartstrings. Join us and don't miss a single beat, because these stories, like this one, only come alive when you're along for the ride.